Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the SFF as Political Text panel. With the awesome Dr. Karen Lensman and the awesome Alexi. Why did I have to put their darn politics in the book/story? It's a complaint or question you hear often. In this panel, we'll talk about just how silly a complaint that is. We'll talk about the difference between being explicitly and implicitly political, and we'll try to get you to read a whole bunch of stories and books. Speaking of stories and books, my panelists have written those. And like his icon guest of honor, Dr. Karen Lensman is one of my personal heroes. This is going to be fun. Okay, first question. To each of you, tell us a bit about the political aspects of your novels, or in Karen's case, novel.
It's 1 2/3, because 2/3 of the second book is already written.
That's good. That's good. So I guess it's fairly easy for me to say what the political aspects of my novels have been, because of course that's been a topic of much discussion, which is, well, I guess the most obvious political aspect is the choice to use the feminine pronoun as the default rather than the masculine, which is common in English, even though it's not grammatically required. And that's the obvious political text on top of it, to which some people have objected. There is also the way the book is also about the sorts of colonialist assumptions behind a lot of space opera adventures, which assume a civilized center taking over and bringing civilization to, you know, the savage outlying areas. And I love those stories. I grew up on those stories. And when I look at what those stories came out of, that's very unsettling. And so that's also what the trilogy is about. Fewer people commented on that because more people got stuck on the pronouns, and many of them never read the book because they were stuck on the pronouns. And even though plenty of people were saying, this is a fun book with great characters, there were plenty of people saying, but nobody ever talks about anything except the pronouns. Which was true, everybody talked about the pronouns, but nobody saw they were talking about anything else. And so everyone said, well, this is just a political lecture, right? So yes, those are the political aspects of my books.
Sorry that I have to correct you about the book that you've written. I would say a lot of things about it. It makes me think a lot of things. It makes you reconsider. Fun is not really something I would stick on that book. It was interesting to read, very, expanding the I didn't have that much fun.
Providence is super fun.
Providence, I have to admit, I knew the trilogy was fairly heavy going, and so when I wrote the fourth book, Providence, which has just been translated into Hebrew and is launched yesterday, so it's available. And I hope y'all read it. I said to myself, it's time for a light, fluffy adventure. I just want fun. And so that book is meant to just be fun. But fun is still political.
Thinking of something to say about it, but it was funny as it was, so I'm just gonna...
Good.
What?
Tell us about your stuff. I want to hear because I haven't read your work. So
I gave you a book yesterday. How come you haven't finished it? Just because it's in Hebrew?
I'm working. I have my Teach Yourself Hebrew book, and I'm working on it. It'll take me a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, we did talk earlier today about you can Google Translate that. I'm sure that works amazingly for books.
And why do they pay translators when you have Google Translate? Right.
I keep wondering. Why
There's my translator down here. He's fabulous.
Why do they give me money?
No, Google Translate will not do it.
No.
You really want me to talk about the politics?
Yes, I really do.
Well, it sucks.
In your novel,
It also sucks. My novel, and I'm literally only saying it because podcast. Anne is here, and I actually know she didn't read the book. So the book, Heart of the Circle, some of you may have bought it and or read it. I took a shortcut because it's an urban fantasy and it's in Israel. So basically what I did was taking the Israeli political situation, and gay rights, whatever, you know, everything, religious fundamentalists. I suck at this. Can somebody else talk about it?
You're doing great. Religious fundamentalists. You have it right. Continue.
Yes. I remember the first time you tried to explain your book in English to someone. You're getting better.
May I talk a bit about that? So it has nothing to do with science fiction or politics.
Briefly.
Okay, so on Worldcon, which was in Helsinki, I know it's like the 15th time I remember. It just was a really life-changing experience. It was like Eikon, only smaller, and a lot of people spoke English. So on Worldcon, it was 6 months before my book came out. I already had a contract. I was already far into the editing process, but it didn't feel real. And then דידי and I went, you know, we walked around because he's a friend and stuff, and he kept on pulling authors, telling them, Ken has a book coming out. Ken, tell them about your book. And I was like, it's in Hebrew.
This was before the announcement that I'm sure you've all heard, that Karen's book will be coming out in English next year.
And then you won't have an excuse.
Then I won't have to teach myself Hebrew.
So I don't. The problem with what you started saying, the statement that why do you have to insert politics into your books, is that politics isn't. Politics affects everything.
Yes.
And
no,
everything.
we're going to get to that. You're trying to get away from talking about politics in your book. You need to start talking about these political aspects of your book.
Tell us about your book.
Tell us about your book.
Stop making me tell you about my book. It's a wonderful love story. Nothing bad ever happens to anybody. There's magic.
Wait, yeah, she said a true thing.
See? And it's beautiful. And everything is good, and there's a happy ending, because you're really happy that the book ended, so nothing bad ever gonna happen again.
No,
But
seriously.
the political situation in the book is the political situation in Israel. I wrote this book because I had to say stuff, and I couldn't just say it, because how many times can you listen to somebody telling you, oh, you shouldn't be killing anybody who thinks differently than you. You should accept other opinions, unless they're stupid. And so I just put it in a book and added magic. And love. And stuff. What? It's out, you can buy it. Go buy it. Please.
So, you were starting to answer that, you know, trying to get away from my previous question, so now you will have a chance. So, why did you have to put your damn politics in my entertainment?
Well, she only put pronouns in, I don't...
That is not true.
There's nothing but pronouns in my book. It's 300 pages of he, she, it, they.
No he, only
There's no
she.
he.
There's no he. Especially in Hebrew.
That was the political statement.
Okay, now, you've infected Anne with not answering questions. This is terrible.
Yeshua Poli, help me out here.
Personal is political.
Thank you. Yeah, so everything, I have to kids, and I have to explain to them why we cannot use a bus on Saturday, why we have to treat people as equal, because apparently not everybody seems to think that if you're a person, you deserve equal rights, you know, to breathe. And everything political is influencing our life, and writing anything, and not only a book, I mean, short stories. I mean, Okay, the last one isn't, but the one previous, in Once Upon a Future, the early anthology, if you look in each one of the short stories in there, you find politics, because we live in a certain world and we have to say things about things that aren't right. And can we do this panel in Hebrew? I am so much better and saying things when I don't have a lackey sitting next to me. And I have to, explain things in a different language.
I agree with all of that. I think what gets lost when the people say, well, I just want a good story, right? How come there has to be politics in my good story? The problem is that anytime you tell a story, you're talking about the world, you're describing it as you see it, and any description of the world contains assumptions about how the world ought to be. And if your idea of how the world ought to be is the same as how the world is, that's a political statement. Supporting the status quo, supporting things as they are, is a political statement. But since it is things as they are, it seems like it's not, because it's water to a fish. So when you describe things in the way that everybody assumes is true, it doesn't look like you're making a political statement, but you absolutely are. And as soon as you disagree, suddenly it looks like you're being political, but it's all political. And I think a lot of times when people say, but why is this so political? You're just shoving your politics into my face. What they're saying is, you're saying something I don't agree with. If the politics are politics they agree with, they're fine, it's not politics, right? Yeah, it's funny how that works, right?
When it's, sorry?
When it have people say, why can't science fiction be non-political, like in the old times, like in Heinlein's days?
Or you know my favorite? Why can't science fiction be just good entertainment with none of this message stuff, like Star Trek was?
Or why can't Star Trek be all of that, like it used to be?
Like Star Trek used to be, yeah.
When it comes up whenever they say, all these women writing science fiction, and I'm like, Mary Shelley.
Not to mention the entirety of the 1970s, right? Like, oh, all of a sudden there's these women writing science fiction. Yeah, only for the past 50, 60, 70, 80, 200 years, right?
Yeah. Say thank you that we even put in characters in your science fiction. Asimov.
Is anything ever not political? Can you write something without it being political? Is that even a possibility?
Well, technically, if you write about white men going out to conquer the galaxy...
That's not political.
That's not political.
That's not political.
Yeah.
As soon as you have a woman going out to conquer the galaxy, however, that's politics. No, no, no.
If you have two women talking in a book about how wonderful the hero, the male, masculine hero is, that's not political.
That's not politics.
Yeah.
That's not political.
However, if one of them will sleep with the other woman, that's just porn.
That's just bad writing. Just like, they also, the two women, the only thing they talk, because we know, all of us women in this room, we know this, right? Whenever we get together and talk, we always talk about men.
Or our kids.
Or our kids.
Or our wish to have kids. With the men.
There's really nothing else. There's nothing else in the world that matters to a woman. So if you have a book where two women are talking about something that isn't men or children, that's just bad writing. Or unforgivable politics, yes.
I'm going to say something about my book, because the hero is male. And since he's the hero, and it's a first person, past tense book, then he has to be in a room. So there's actually no point where two women speak with each other without him being part of the conversation in one way or another. And then when the book came out, my brother-in-law came back and said, could it be that your book doesn't pass the Bechdel test? I was like, I'm so sorry. But it's badly written.
Does my book pass the Bechdel test?
How can we know? We don't know anyone.
Well, just don't know. We just don't know.
Well, actually it does. I actually looked.
The Nilters think that Seyfarden is male, which is very different from Seyfarden being male. Seyfarden is Radshai. Yeah.
Also, audience will get to talk later, not now.
Well, of course it does, because all the ancillaries talk with each other.
Okay, all right, all the ancillaries talk with each other. I'll buy that.
Although for some reason they don't talk about their desire to have children, so
That is very weird. I have a related question. I have read books that are written from the point of view of women, written by men. Why are you constantly thinking about your boobs?
well, they're always in the way.
It's biological. It's a genetic thing. If you've got boobs, you can't think about anything else. If you see a mirror, you gotta stop and look.
And you usually have to, whenever, I don't know about you, but whenever I get home and get completely naked, walk in front of the mirror and go, oh, look at my body. Especially after 2 pregnancies.
Yes.
Okay, let's try and slightly get back to topic.
And that's not political at all.
No.
That's not political at all.
I just, sorry. Whenever
We did say the personal is political.
we can say, no, but the thing is that you always, when you look at, even the physical description in a book are political. Because you can see it's got the male gaze, right? You can see it in the book. He looked at her thighs, and then he looked at her waist, and I'm like, I don't give a shit. Is she intelligent? Can she speak?
And that's what's going on, of course, with all the women characters written by many men write women very well. I don't want to make it sound like men can't write women, but you do see the characters who they walk past the mirror and they're like, well, I'm still pretty and I'm not too fat and my stomach is nice and flat and my boobs are nice and large, and you're like, that's the male gaze. That's the man assuming that everyone looks at women the way he looks at women. And that's also telling you that he always looks at women evaluating their sexual attractiveness. And that's not neutral. That's not just the way to describe a character. The words you use and the kind of features you pick to describe are intensely political, but certain views look normal and neutral because they're what we see most of the time.
And the most common mistake is not that men writing women or women writing men, because obviously I've written from a male point of view because I had to tell the story from his point of view. So one of my favorite threats was to make his love interest a woman, but that's just between my editor and me. But the thing is that the question is whether or not you're looking at your characters as real people. Because I do look at the mirror often, or from time to time, and I make sure that I look okay. I make out like everybody does that. The question is in this book or in this story, everybody does that. If you have both men and women stopping from the mirror and everything else, sorry, I've been too binary, but if you stop in front of the mirror and everybody is checking out to make sure they don't have stains on their nose, then that's okay. If everybody is looking and checking out their own breasts, you have a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when it's a certain class of people, or and in particular that we've got this class of people always looking at their attractiveness. It does show they don't have an internal existence. They exist only for the external. So it's not the act of looking in the mirror, it's the way it's described, and it's how frequent it is, and always of particular kinds of characters, yeah.
Yeah, I think I would maybe put it slightly differently in that the issue isn't do writers think of characters from the opposite sex as people? Do they think of people from the opposite sex as people? I think that the thinking of the characters is just a manifestation often.
Well, I think it's, I take your point, and I think sometimes that is the case, but I think it's a little more complicated because we learn to write fiction by reading fiction. And I have known particularly young writers who are young men who write women characters who are very much just assemblages of cliches about women. And they know lots of fabulous women, and they're great guys, and they haven't noticed the mismatch between what they're putting down on the page and what's out in the real world, because we're so used to looking at the world through the lens of the narratives that we're familiar with. And so it's really easy to mistake the map for the territory and not even realize that you do have an appreciation for the people in your life, but you're still seeing them through that lens of cliches. And so it's not that you don't appreciate the humanity of the women or other folks in your life, it's that it's so hard to move those conventional phrases aside when you start talking about them. But there are also, that's my theory, and I made it up just now, it's a good one.
Good one, yeah. I would,
but there are, granted, there are authors who, when they write about women, it's pretty clear that they just don't know or believe that women are people in the same way that they are. Right?
Yeah, but the issue you raised is particularly important because it's an issue of representation. And, a long time ago, my first gig as an editor, I would get these manuscripts that were written by Israeli authors who had never been to the United States of America, and their main characters were John and Jane, and the book would start at the airport of Denver. And I was like, why are you writing these people in this place? And the answer is, that's the science fiction they saw and read.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, actually the transformation of Israeli science fiction community and writing is extremely interesting.
Yes.
Because we went from writing about John and Jane, and we all did that. We all did that, I promise you. About writing about, or Buffy and Angel, doesn't matter. Whenever you start writing about something that you saw, and in the last 15 years or so, we finally get real Israeli science fiction that happens in Israel, that has Israeli issues, that suddenly you write a story and it has Israeli political problem, including personal problem that arise from the Israeli society, because having easy access to guns and weapons is different in Israel than it is in the States. Because we actually do have people walking around with guns, and we call them soldiers, and we kind of trust them to help us. So the whole conflict is different all of a sudden.
I want to talk a bit about two different aspects of politics in fiction, which is politics as world building versus politics as plot. As in, when the book is politics as world building, being aware of politics as a factor when you're creating your world. Politics as plot, being the book deals with politics explicitly.
Can you give an example?
I'm going to give an example. A good example would be, for instance, Mal Coulter's Centennial Cycle, which is a series of books that came out the past few years that deal with the politics of the late 21st century. There's elections.
Can you give an example from a book I've read?
I don't know what you've read.
So I'm not sure, plot and world building are so connected to each other, but maybe you're thinking about the difference between a story that implies politics just by its features versus a story that is an explicitly, openly political plot line.
Implicit versus explicit, yeah. Yes, that is what I'm saying, asking about.
I'm thinking Dune, but I don't know which of the parts Dune goes to. Because I think
Dune goes to both.
Yeah, because I'm thinking Dune and I'm thinking of the Raj for some reason. But
I think everything that's explicitly political,
also be implicit.
yes, unless it's terrible. But yeah, why deal with things that are explicitly political rather than just leaving that as part of the world building, is my question.
Because everything is fair game for a story. And I also think the question of what's implicit and what's explicit is very much a matter of who's reading. Because depending on what context you're standing in, you may or may not know what the author was intending to explicitly write about. Something very old, for instance, where you don't know the context when it was written. Or I've had, and I found it very interesting to see people talk about my own work and say, well, obviously, Lecky meant to do this thing. And I'll be like, really? That's news to me. But your experience as a reader is what it is. You're going to interpret it. There is no wrong experience of the book. And so some people are going to find a political thing very explicit and very, you know, sledgehammer to the face. And some people are going to go, I didn't see anything like that. I was just watching planets explode, right? And so I think it's kind of difficult to separate out which is which, because it depends on who's reading and when they're reading and what language they're reading in and what's going on while they're reading. All of those things factor into what's explicit and what's implicit.
Yeah, I think Pride and Prejudice, by a girl you may have heard her name. It's Jane. It's from a city.
Jane Dallas?
Something like that. Denver.
Jane Houston?
Jane San Antonio.
Jane San Antonio.
One of the things that I've never learned English. I learned English. I majored in English in university. So when I read Pride and Prejudice, it was kind of like reading a really weird fantasy book with no magic in it. Because, lucky for me, Mary Robinette Kowal wrote it with magic. But the thing is that a lot of it was so strange and weird. Like the woman having no possession, and when the men will die, they will be thrown to the streets. And they have to get married, or they will die with nothing. And reading it made me, and started thinking about, because this is politics. It's the small things. It's not the what is the next law about whatever. Nobody cares about the law. Really, nobody cares about it. What you care about is the little things that drive your world. This is the real politics. And in Pride and Prejudice and everything else, the politics is there. It's very explicit. For us, it's very implicit for the people of her time. I'm guessing, because I didn't live 200 years ago. But
yes, I meant explicit or implicit from the author's position. I mean, when you are writing it, that's what I meant.
Why? So in the process of each of us writing our books,
yes.
Why and how do we decide to be explicit or implicit?
Yes, because you're author.
Yeah,
so
when I wrote Pride and Prejudice.
That was you? I love your work.
Thank you. I don't really. It feels kind of, you know, old.
You guys have all seen the pictures of Jane Austen next to a picture of
Mary
Robinette Kowal, right? You know it's the same person. Yeah. It's very eerie.
I don't, you know, I think sometimes I decide to say something explicitly, but I'm not sure why exactly. Often you were talking about, you know, we're living in a situation and you just can't not say something, right? And I think when that happens, then I'm going to be explicit. But even then, I'm trying to fit it into the whole. I'm not trying to say, and this is the chapter where I lecture you about what I believe and what you ought to believe. I'm never going to do that. I will sometimes go, you know what? I've heard readers talk about how frustrating it is that they never see any asexual characters, they never see any trans characters, or they never see any, and is there an opportunity for me to put somebody on stage, or to, maybe I know something about a character, but it's not on the page, maybe I need to then put it on the page, so that people can see that. And I will definitely think about that. But I almost never say, now, the moral of this novel is going to be this thing, and now I'm going to put it in. I never do that. I'm always like, what are the characters doing next? And obviously the things I believe are going to come out in that. But I'm never sitting down saying, now what do I believe and how can I make the characters tell the reader that? I'm never doing that, actually.
I know what the moral of the story is. Of ancillary justice, at least. It's never blow up a ship, because it will come to bite you in the ancillaries.
At which point you will recruit her, as one does.
Spoilers. And the thing, it's not a big spoiler. It's in the trailer.
Well, it's obvious from the first chapter. Yeah, it's obvious something happened.
Yeah. No, also, drugs are bad. That's
drugs are bad.
The moral of the story. The thing is that the minute...
And tea's good.
Tea and alak, apparently, which is disgusting. I don't know why everybody in the book keeps on drinking this horrible liquid. I think the minute, it's exactly what you said, the minute you pick someone to a story, you make a political statement. If you pick a white male from a socioeconomic class, middle, high socioeconomic class, you pick a certain viewpoint. You make a statement. If you make them straight, or you make them gay, if you make them trans, or if you make them asexual, if you make them, I don't know, wear a dress and hide it from their friends, you make a political statement. If you give them friends, if you don't give them friends, if you give them friends that they have to hide something, and this is the beginning, this is only the beginning. You don't go into a book and say, now we will tell you why the current government sucks. Because, especially in Israel, the current government will not last until the book comes out. Okay?
On the other hand, the next one will probably also suck.
And will be the same, but, you know, not be true.
I wanted to talk a bit about something that you mentioned and was also in my notes for this, which is decolonizing science fiction, which I think is an ongoing project, and it's something I'm interested to hear your thoughts on as an ongoing project, and as somebody who's doing your part for that.
It's a huge project, because if you go back, Frankenstein notwithstanding, a lot of when you get to the Victorians, the first Martian invasion story, that's like a famous kind of cliched science fiction story. It's an explicit comment on British colonialism. And that story template gets carried forward as like an adventure story. And it's informed all of science fiction's sort of genetic material. All of those, a lot of British adventure stories that are about, you know, going to mysterious Africa and finding ancient ruins and stuff, that translates into those sort of ancient alien archaeology things, which, when you stop and think about it, it's pretty insulting. Oh, we Europeans are humans, and you Africans are mysterious vanished aliens who are conveniently all dead.
Or will be our slaves.
Yeah, or who will be our slaves, who are obviously inferior, right? Or, when you grow up reading science fiction, you grow up steeped in many of these stories, and it can be really difficult. I think actually it's an important question that I don't know the answer to. Can you use those stories and not perpetuate some of those ideas? Is it even possible to do? And I don't know the answer. All I know is that I grew up loving many of those stories, and I'm trying my best to take the thing that I loved and do something with it that I don't find terrible, to turn it, the thing that I loved, into something that I can still love going forward. I don't know if it's possible, but I think the best any of us can do, we can only do the best we can, and we can't know the future, so all we can do is think hard about what we're doing and then make the best choices that we can.
I think that the thing is that what I love, I will talk all about myself, what I love about science fiction and fantasy is the sense of wonder, the ability to look further. The first time I've read Asimov, which is the first book I've ever read, which was science fiction as an adult, I suddenly met someone else who looks up at the skies and think, maybe somebody's looking right at me right now. It was the very first time I remember thinking, I'm not alone in this. And this sense exists throughout everything. And this sense is not political. The ability to look at someone else and feel empathy, and feel, I wonder if you feel the same. Non-judgmental, I don't care if you do or don't, I just wonder if you do. This is the basics. And then wherever we want to talk about, wherever we want to take that, we can take it to conquering new planets, or take it to the women the men don't see. We can still talk about alien invasion and aliens studying us, and aliens and us rebellious against men, or, you know, aliens. We can take it to all different kinds of places, as long as we keep on this little thing of empathy inside. She said it much better than me.
And now to my favorite thing, and the reason why, one of the big reasons why I do panels, book and story recs. Think of a book or a story or both that deal with politics in a way you find interesting and recommend it to the audience here.
Okay, so there's this new book I've read, Ancillary Justice. It's
Not that new.
Not that new. It's been out several years. I'm terrible with book and story recs because I read books and stories and I go, wow, this is fabulous. And then I sit at something like somebody says, recommend me a book, and I go, did I ever read a book? But since it's hard for me, since I don't classify things as political fiction or not political fiction, because they pretty much all are, I think anyone here who has not read Rivers Solomon's Unkindness of Ghosts really should. I don't think it's in Hebrew.
It is not. I also second that. By the way, it could have also been mentioned in the previous panel.
Yes, it totally could have.
Because there's no real sexual relationship in it. No romantic relationship.
I was going to say that.
Not romantic.
It's an amazing book. But I'm trying to think what else would be fabulous that would be recommended because it's political, but it's really all political. Folks here read Octavia Butler? Yes, Octavia Butler's fabulous. Read anything by Octavia Butler, yeah.
I'm going to recommend a book that actually was translated to Hebrew. I'm
yes,
sorry.
that's
because
that's mostly what you read.
Now you will. Well, yeah, life is short.
No, I love the fact that there are people who mostly read in Hebrew. My entire career as a translator and now publisher depends on it.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, it's not from your publishing house, it's from Graf. So those close to me can see the hearts showing up in my eyes when I say Daryl Gregory.
Former Icon Guest of Honor.
Okay, so Daryl Gregory has several books being translated to Hebrew, The Devil's Alphabet and Pandemonium, and 2-3 short stories, The Damascus and another, and Second Body's Present Tense was translated.
Present tense.
That one. So excuse me for a second. גוף שני הווה, פנדמוניום, א' ב' של השטן ודמשק שהופיע באתר העבודה. All of them. What?
We're all completely fine.
Right, we're all completely fine. כולנו ממש בסדר. That was my Hebrew point. But I'm gonna talk about...
Published by Graf, but I did translate all the novels.
I know. But the book that wasn't translated, and it was, at first it's the most recent Daryl I've read, and also it's very political, and it has a lot to say about the political structure and the crumbling of society, like any other Daryl book, is Raising Stony Mayhill, which is a wonderful audiobook, and I've recommended it a couple of times. Raising Stony Mayhill starts right after the first zombie apocalypse ended. So as you can imagine, there's more to come. And it's being told from the point of view of a zombie. It's an amazing book, it's very beautiful, and it talks about political structures and what we take for granted and what we can change, and what moves we must never do when we try to change the way society is built. And I'm not going to say anything else because it's spoilers, but it's an amazing book. Amazing.
Is Nora Jemison translated?
I was just going to say that I was going to mention a book that I know you would have mentioned had it come to you, and that is The Fifth Season and its two sequels in the Broken Earth trilogy that will be coming to Hebrew next year from Graf Publishing.
Good.
Yes.
Those are amazing.
This is a really good thing that you just said, because I was just about to start reading it in English, and now you're making me very happy.
Yes, translated by Yael Achmon.
Can I give another example of a very political book, which we, for some reason, didn't mention, which is The Hunger Games? I think. Yes. I mean, you will correct me if I'm wrong. You've heard of it? It's about this girl. She has a sister.
It was kind of popular.
Yeah. There was a movie.
Didn't they adapt it to, I don't know, was it a YouTube show or?
I don't remember. Netflix, maybe. So, in The Hunger Games, and the personal is the political. She's not all, it's like you think, oh yeah, the president is corrupt. But what she's actually talking about is the relationship between grown-ups and children. And where is the boundary between childhood and adulthood? And this is really important because the minute you become an adult, you have a lot of responsibility, but you also have control of your life. Whereas when you're a child, you have no control of your life, and everything is decided for you by the adults. And The Hunger Games is precisely on this point.
That was also translated by Lachman.
This is why I remembered. But I will give you a book that wasn't translated by Lachman, which is it's Xor Shebarash. Patrick Ness.
The Knife of
Never Letting Go. Also, The Knife of Never Letting Go is exactly about this point in your life when you have to cross the border between being a child whose everything is decided for you to being an adult who has control of their own life. And this is extremely political because the minute you decide where the bar is, you give someone the rights, their rights. And it's up to the grown-ups to decide when somebody can become a grown-up, which is kind of like having men decide when women are allowed to vote.
Yes, I want to mention a story that I would like to hope you've all read. Tell me if you've all read The Ones Who Walk Away from Melas. Raise your hands if you have.
כן, זה גם נמצא באתר האגודה, it was translated by Emmanuel.
Yes.
אלה המפנים עורפם לאומלס, מי עוזב את אומלס?
מי עוזב את אומלס עיר העושר, I believe.
It was translated?
At least twice.
At least twice, one of them by Emmanuel. As the translator know their Hebrew name.
We forget. Basically, look for omelas in the Israeli Society for Science Fiction and Fantasies website, written by Ursula Le Guin, to my mind, probably the most politically important short story in science fiction.
There's an explicitly political story right there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And everything Ali Sheldon wrote, almost everything by Tiftrich.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah. Also political.
Yes, also for your example, read everything by Brooke Bolander, also known as Bo Bolander. Unless you don't like stories in which women blow shit up and kill a lot of people, and why would you not?
Do they do that bare breasts, or do they wear something? Cause
I think they're usually fully clothed, unless they're an elephant.
I'm gonna.
Or a raptor.
Another book that is extremely political, and you wouldn't know it when you first read it, because you're 12 and you've just started reading Ender's Game, and you're like, oh my god, this is the best book ever. And then when you're a grown-up, and the Suck Fairy visited it, and suddenly you find a lot of hidden homophobia inside, and every woman must have a man who will satisfy her, otherwise she's broken.
Also, the teachers are right in every single thing they did.
Older men are right, especially if they have ranks.
Yeah, which I read it. It was pretty obvious to me that teachers were the villains, and yet Scott sees it differently.
By the way, it's a book. It's a good book. It's just it it's exactly the example of what you
Yes,
started talking about, is how you take the natural order of things, and of course there's nothing political about it, except the fact that it's extremely political if you're older and wiser.
Okay, what I'm gonna ask you now is, if you have a question, I would like you to come down and sit at that part of the front row, on the part that's closest to me, so I will be able to give you the microphone and you can ask it, so we don't have to do the whole, wait, what did you say? Let me repeat that. So if you have questions, start moving down to the front row. Yes, it is happening.
Now all the audience is coming down to the front row. Didi, what have you done?
I'm not afraid. They don't scare me.
I can recommend Once Upon a Future Again, which is the latest book that you can look at it at the Duhan Agudara outside and get it for free if you're a member of the Israeli Society for Science Fiction. And
also,
there's a lot of, put it up.
Also, if you have a story in the latest Anne would like you to sign her copy.
Please, if you have a story in that, come up and sign my copy.
I have a story in it. But
so,
it's extremely
I'm gonna come on down. I'm a little slow because my knees hurt, but here I am. So what we're gonna do is, the question asker is the person who sits at this chair at the end. You ask your question, you get up and back to your seat, you move down, the next person asks the question. This will work great. Oh my God, we filled the entire front row.
That's what I told you.
Hi. So unfortunately, my question is mostly for Keren, because you wrote about Israeli fan fiction that's set in an Israeli setting. So you talked about Israeli politics, and you mentioned gay rights, and you mentioned religious and non-religious conflicts, but you specifically didn't speak about the Israeli-Arab conflict. So my question is, do you...
I'm so glad you asked me.
So do you speak about that in your book? And if you do or you don't, what does that say as a political statement?
Well...
No. Answers from the stage, questions from the audience.
So...
And move down.
I'm waiting for her to speak. Assuming your gender, sorry. Yes. And with, I should say, with the editor's help, if it will not be cut out from book number 2, it will be there. And there is a specific reason why it wasn't mentioned in book number 1, and I can't say anything else until the book is out, but it does have an explanation. I can't.
Spoilers.
But there's a reason why it isn't being referred to in the first book.
Hi.
Oh, you should also state your name.
Well, my name is Karen. It's on my tag.
We can read. We both can read, you know.
There.
First of all, I can't remember exactly which of you phrased it, but you were discussing writing as a form of empathy, or as an exercise in empathy. And I wanted to thank you for saying that, because it's something that I'm always trying to find a way to phrase. One of my favorite quotes is from John Green, and it's that reading is always an act of empathy. It's always an imagining of what it would be like to be someone else. And I think that writing is much the same. So thank you for saying that. And my question is to both of you. When you're writing some kind of political statement, right? You can either write it in sort of you can either have the character trying to bring about the change that you're talking about, or you can have the change you're talking about as a starting point, as in your book, where all the default pronouns are already female. My question is, do you ever slip up? Are you ever so immersed in the world we currently live in that you find yourself writing the wrong thing in your novel? Like, do you ever accidentally use male pronouns, like, while drafting? Because you're in the same water as the rest of us.
Sort of, sometimes. It's usually not with pronouns, although I have to admit with provenance, where I use 3 pronouns, it's a culture that recognizes 3 genders. The 3rd gender, it was very easy for me to slip and type he instead of e, and so there was a fair amount of that drafting. But I also think that's just a thing that happens, because here we are living in this world, and you just assume things go a particular way, and it's very difficult to see that if things were different, actually these other little things wouldn't go the way you think they do. And sometimes I see them before the manuscript gets to an editor, and sometimes later on I think, oh, why did I think that that was going to be that way? I didn't think it all the way through. But I think it's really difficult to conceptualize how different things would be if the starting conditions were different. So there's always going to be some place that I miss.
Recs are probably going to keep coming to me, so I'm just going to say them. Blackfish City by Sam J. Miller.
Yeah, Blackfish City is fabulous, yeah.
Yeah, it is explicitly political, and Sam is a political organizer and is very smart.
I'm Hila, and I was going to say it's noticeable in your work that, but now I'm not going to say it anymore because of what you said, and sorry. And I'm going to skip right past provenance spoilers and ask the political question. It's somewhat noticeable in provenance that you may have opinions on incarceration and correction.
Oh, and it is? Do you have pronouns in the book?
And from what I understand about American politics, this is a somewhat incendiary topic in American politics.
Yes, it is. It is a very incendiary topic in American politics.
An issue in getting it into the book or in deciding to put it into the book that it might be a very incendiary statement to be making?
So I am actually in a very fortunate position, which is that because my first book was as successful as it was, I can do something outrageous, and mostly my editors are going to let me do it, right? Because there are a number of readers who have said, well, I'm just going to buy the next Anne Leckie. And also because one of the things the first book was so notorious for was that it was so political. How dare you make the feminine the default, right? That was just outrageous. People expect me to be doing something like that. But I didn't start out saying I'm going to write a criticism of prisons, of prisons in the US in particular, because I can't speak to any other situation. I started out saying, okay, I have a character who is a criminal and needs to get out of prison, and then of course, then I was like, yeah, that can't be good, right? And so that was going to come out incidentally, but I have not faced any pushback about that. In fact, you are the first person to mention the whole thing about compassionate removal. But you're absolutely right, and it may well be that people just aren't looking at it, because in the US it is a very contentious topic, and it's a contentious topic for reasons that have to do with racism. Honestly. And racism is a thing that nobody wants to see in the US. If you start to talk about racism, nobody wants to hear you. You're the one being racist. If you mention racism, why you gotta bring this up? If we just all pretend it doesn't exist, it's not really there. And so it's possible that that the people who would be upset are just like, yeah, I don't see that, la la la, I can't hear you, you know. Or maybe just the right people haven't read it to then send me angry emails, I don't know. But you're actually the first person to have mentioned that to me, yeah.
It is quite possible that you know, there are those people and they're like, yeah,
They already know they're not reading my books.
Yeah.
We already know we're not fans of hers, yeah.
There were all those female pronouns in the first one, so, yeah.
Hi, I'm Emily. So my question is, it kind of links into the answer that you gave in the last question, in that you guys have a platform as authors, and you also have a realm of experience that is unique to you, so a lot of us can relate to each other in our experiences as women with sexism and things like that. But do you ever consider using your platform to raise awareness to issues that are outside of your personal sphere that you do think are important, at the risk of speaking over the communities that are people who experience these traumas, such as racism or maybe ableism or just general, there's a lot of politics out there. I'm not sure I understood the question.
So if I understand you correctly, you're asking, have we ever considered as authors, because we feel strongly about these things, speaking about the issues and experiences of groups to whom we don't belong, but that we really want to lend a hand and talk about and yeah. But it's also risky because like, for instance, I could go talk about racism and I'd say, I'm going to write a thing from the point of view of a black American and talk all about racism, and then I could sell the book and it would sell a bajillion copies, but it would be my white girl's view of racism and then not have space for a black person to actually talk about their experience of racism. At the same time, I'm still responsible for speaking up on things, and it's a difficult bind, isn't it? So is that
I work... my day job, well, half of my day job, because I have 2 day jobs, so half of my day job is actually working in a clinic that serves a lot of underprivileged populations. So it's just my daily job. I'm doing stuff. I lost words again. It's all because of you, I think. I had words before I came in this panel.
I took them. I needed them for my next book.
But why did you need my broken English? Yes, I believe, I don't think that as authors we should voice our opinions. I think that as people, especially people with certain privileges, we must speak up. Because I believe that a real, if you've read my book, you know that. I believe that
the struggle.
Struggles can only work if everybody participates. Where you don't say, oh, this is the problem of that population. I'm not going to help because I'm outside this. You need to shout with the people who are in pain. It's our job, not necessarily the one that we are being paid to, but it's our job to shout for people who cannot scream. And we must use our privileges. And I do it, everybody, we have to do it.
Yeah, I feel very much that I agree that I do have a responsibility to use my privilege to help make people aware of things, but I also definitely do not want to go in and tell someone's story for them. And so when I say, oh, you know what, I think I do want to speak up about a thing, I try and say, all right, I want to provide representation and say these people exist and I'm there without trying to tell their story. Do you know what I'm saying? So for instance, I think there's a big difference between telling a story about a trans person and telling a story about being trans, right? There's a difference between telling a story about a black person and telling a story about the experience of being black. And I don't think it's my place to tell the story about the experience of being black or the experience of being trans, but I do have a responsibility to say, you know what, there are trans people in this world and they belong in my story. And they even sometimes can be the hero of my story, right? But it is a delicate balance, and I don't doubt that at some point I will or have stepped into something that I shouldn't have, and I hope when that happens, when someone comes to me and says, you know, you've appropriated or you've done something offensive, I hope my response is to say, thank you for telling me, and I'm going to think about what you've told me and try and remember that going forward. And instead of, because I have seen, I know I said this last night, I have seen people respond to that by saying, well, then I'll just never write about gay people again, see what you did, right? And that's just, don't even get me started on that.
You have lost a powerful ally.
Right. How dare you offend me? Well, that's totally showing what a great ally I am, right? But it is complicated, but I think it's important to try and be aware of it when I'm writing.
Yeah, I will also add, and I know Anne does this, is another thing is to promote the voices of people from those communities.
Oh, absolutely, because the other thing that happens, of course, is that, you know, here I am, a straight white girl, and I'm going to write a story about gay guys, and that's going to be very palatable to straight white readers.
You're doing my voice wrong. You know, it needs to be lower a bit.
And then, you know, a gay guy wants to write a story about his experience, and everybody's like, well, Why would we buy that? We have Anne Leckie's story, right? Once again, not being a great ally doing that. Yeah, so I do try to be aware of who out there is writing from their own experience and say, you know what, you should read these people because they're awesome. And the more you read of their work, the more you will appreciate it. Yeah.
All right, so my name is Omer, and you were speaking about, what was the response? And you were speaking about writing female characters and how bad it is to have them look in the mirror and that. And, well, personally in my writing there's a problem that I can't write female characters without making it overly cliched or sexist or feeling like a forced gender swap of a male character. So is there a way to write a character with a distinguishable gender identity, female or male, without touching their physiology or cliches?
So there is a flippant answer to this, and it's flippant and potentially insulting, and I don't mean it to be. And the flippant answer is you write them as other human beings, right?
Yeah.
And so the best thing to do is think about the women you know in your real life. And think about the way that you would describe them. And then when you find yourself describing them with a cliche, say, no, that's not right, I need to find different words. And practice describing the women that you know in ways that are not cliched. And look at them when you say, but they're doing the cliched thing. Question yourself and say, no, if I describe this differently, does it look the same? And so one of the things about being a writer is always looking around you at the world. Writers are always looking at what people are doing, listening to what people are saying, looking, like when there's an American sort of literary writer who wrote a famous writing instruction book, John Gardner, and he talked about how it could be actually sort of embarrassing and upsetting. Once he was driving and there was a car accident by the side of the road, and he stopped his car and he got out to go help the people, and he was really embarrassed because the thoughts that were running through his mind were, how will I describe the way it looks with the steering column going through the stomach of the person that's in the car, right?
Sorry for interrupting.
Go right ahead.
In 2016, we lost a member of our community. And in order not to break down in the funeral, I kept on telling myself, it's research, it's research, it's research, it's for research.
Yes. Writers are always looking around and thinking, how would we write this down? So whenever you have a problem describing something, when your descriptions aren't working, then you want to look very carefully at whatever it is you're trying to describe and say, not using the words that aren't working, how would I describe this? It can be difficult. I'm not going to lie to you, it's hard. It's one of the hardest parts of the job. But that's where you start, and you just keep doing that.
I would also like to suggest read more. Read more specifically
read
stories.
Things by women.
Yeah, read a lot of Tipetry. Seriously, I keep on bringing her up, and I keep on mispronouncing her name, which is Sheldon.
No, Tipetry is
like,
good.
She writes, pay attention to the way she describes women. Pay attention to the way she describes the female relationship. Because a female relationship is different when a male is around and when you're only around female. And another thing, and I'm going to say a really big cheat, sorry. Write them as males. If it works for you to write a character as a male and they come out awesome and great and normal and interesting, write the female characters as male. Physiology, unless you actually need to breastfeed or take a leak,
The physiology.
or you know, trying on a dress, then the physiology doesn't really influence your life. Unless you're trying to write something about how society treats women, which is something completely different. But if you write, if your good writing comes out as male, just write them as male and then change the pronouns. Goodbye. That's an evil cheat. I'm so sorry.
It's a place to start, actually. When you think about it, it's a good place to start. Then you say, why is it different?
Yeah, and then you look at it and you find out why you write women wrong when they're 51% of the population in some countries.
Hi, I'm Benny. Going back to something you mentioned, there was a Facebook post by Rotem Baruchin, which is a wonderful Israeli...
I love her, she's nice.
Yeah. Feminist writer, and she wrote that how important it is for her to put LGBT characters, and especially lesbian characters, as in the main roles or in important parts of the story, because growing up, it was really, really important for her to see Tara and Willow and Zina and Gabrielle and all the others. And when she writes those characters, she often thinks explicitly of who is going to be inspired by them. Do you find yourself thinking explicitly of, like, whose life, what reader's life will you influence by putting this character or writing it this way or another way?
I was going to say, this is when I insert the subconscious message of send me money inside my stories, but not. Yes, and I did it specifically on a couple of short stories, which Rotem named Your Motherhood Stories. When you see a mother in a story that I've written, it doesn't matter if it's in Heart of Circle or in the latest one here, especially when she's in post-labor. So after you give birth, which is supposedly the best thing that's ever happened to you, and thankfully today my kids are not in the crowd, so I can tell you it's not child labor, it's not all it was meant to be, you know. It's terrible. It's terrible. It was one of the worst, 6 months of my life. Both kids. Post-labor, your hormones are up the roof. You have no idea what you're doing. Your body is turning against you. Nothing is good. Everything is shitty. And then the baby starts crying. And you don't know why. And you start crying too. And that's your life for years and years and years. So the only point where I put someone from my...
someone who shares your identity.
My identity, which is very lacking, because science fiction and fantasy usually don't talk about motherhood. They never, actually, I don't remember them. The women the men don't see has something to do with motherhood, but the child is a grown-up. She's a teenager. You don't see a mother struggling, and if you do, she's holding the baby on one hand and then fights with a sword in another. None of the mothers I've ever read about in science fiction ever sit on the sofa and cry because they just don't know what the hell they're doing, and everything is terrible, and they're screwing their baby's life even though they're only 3 days old. So in my short stories, if you ever see a mother, especially if she's in distress, and she is in distress because she's a mother, that's when I think of a mother reading my book, my story.
Yeah, and I have occasionally sat down and said, I've seen readers talk about who they are and what they value and what they've taken out of my books, and every now and then I have put a character in a thing and gone, those people, when they get to that, they're going to really love that. That's going to make them happy. I really hope, because it's almost like a present for them, right? For the most part, that's been very gratifying to see people go, oh, I saw that character. Is it really did I see what I think I just saw? Yeah, you did, yeah. So I do try to do that to the best that I can. Yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I will once again mention Shauna McGuire, who will create characters who share the identity of her friends who are underrepresented. And pretty much every book has, this person is for my asexual friend, for instance. That's Nancy in Every Heart a Doorway, out in Nova Press.
My name is Shlomi, and short thing as an aside note, politically explicit stories create conflict. Conflict makes good story, therefore politically explicit stories are good and being made for story. But the main issue is that what people decide to talk about as politics, it's also a political decision. You said that Americans don't like to talk about race. Me, from the outside, a lot of what they think they think and do, look up.
Now might be the time to mention my usual rule of a question is a short sentence with a question mark at the end. We do not have a lot of time. We have 15 minutes in this panel.
Look everything to the lens of race. Voting fraud, let's get to the race. You said everybody's blamed to be racist. Very
question.
So what are others things that we think today, as the way to look at the world, are also implicitly racist? So,
what other things are actually driven by? It's really almost anything that's a contentious. Well, I'm speaking from the point of view of American politics. Almost everything contentious political issues are driven by racism in one way or another. And I can't speak to politics anywhere else. But whenever you see a major political figure going, well, this is a big problem, and law and order, and we need to fix this, and why people are cheating on this, and whatever, there's almost always a racist subtext. But I can't speak for any place else. And for historical reasons, that's the case in the US for historical reasons. And I don't know about anywhere else.
It's the case here for historical reasons.
Hi, I'm Eiley. I enjoyed you so much. You're so much fun and edifying and basically the American version of Karen in many ways. My question is for both of you. Since you're writing in a time where the audience voice is way more heard than ever before, I'd like to know if and in which cases political things that you wrote about, your opinion, stances changed thanks to writing and the response you got from it. And if any responses you got from the audience or from backlash or from online discourses about your books and methods that you helped surface, if it's helped to change or shift with things that you wrote about.
For me, definitely. When I started writing Ancillary Justice, I had a very simplistic idea of gender, and it was the process of writing Ancillary Justice and the rest of the books that really led to my learning a lot more about different conceptions of gender and different people's experience of their own gender. So there's it's obvious if you look for it. You can see in the beginning of Ancillary Justice, I'm assuming there are two genders, and that it's obvious, you know. And by the time I was done with the book, I had learned a lot more. And that was one of the things that early on some critics of the book had some criticisms about. For instance, the use of the generic feminine, erasing masculine and particularly transmasculine identities. And that was one of the reasons why when I wrote Providence, I said that I'm not going to do that. I'm going to address that, say, it's not that the whole galaxy isn't like this. Gender is more complicated in other places. There is all of this going on. I'm not trying to say that there's only, that gender is just a shmush and it's all one thing and, you know, there's no difference. But I also didn't want to say, well, gender, of course, is exactly the way that 20th century Americans view of it, you know. So I did definitely listen to what folks were saying about the book and think about it, partly because writing that first book was a process of learning to begin with. So yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Michael, and my question is this. In science fiction, space opera, and especially in fantasy, we have a lot of dictators, emperors, kings, princesses, autocrats. However, there's very little in the way of democracy. Why, in your opinion, is that? And are there any good examples of democracy in science fiction, and especially in fantasy, that you would recommend?
Michael, we don't really have good democracies in real life.
We have tries at them, though. I suspect that There's a couple things operating that fantasy is supposedly much based on European medieval stuff, and we have a very simplistic idea of how medieval European governments worked. We think, oh, it's the king, and the king told everybody what to do. In fact, it's far more complicated. But it's easier to write about one person who can order armies to go do whatever than it is to write about weeks of the council debating on something. But you're right, this is the problem, which is one of the reasons why in Providence the government is in fact a representative, people vote, there's an election coming up, that's part of what's going on in the story. You're absolutely right, and as much as I love all the, well, we have the princess and the prince and they're wearing gold and jewels and it's wonderful and you just have one person, at the same time I'm like, I grew up in a democracy and I grew up to think that kings were not a good idea, and yet I'm writing about the Galactic Emperor, right? So that's a real problem. So that is something that I know I've been trying to get my brain to turn in another direction, right?
May I answer too? Yeah. No, because yes, thank you. So in The Expanse, you get to see a lot of different, opera, space and stuff. You get to see different kinds of government. I can't believe I'm going to say that, but in episode 1 of Star Wars, you get 2 hours of political debates.
That's true.
And
There are trade federations.
no, I'm sorry. And the federation is a federation, apparently. The thing is, you were born in the democracy, which is awesome. I am living in a crumbling democracy. And not that I think that
China is
one I was
good.
born in too.
Lately, you could say that about the one I was born in, yeah.
I'm so trying not to say anything right now because I don't understand enough in American politics. But in Israel,
I don't understand anymore either.
It has something to do with the hair and color. The thing is that Israel democracy sucks, and democracy basically sucks. It's not a very good political method. It's just the best that we have currently. So
Yes,
What was the quote? It's the worst system there is except for all the others?
Yes, I once again tell people to read Infomocracy by Malka Alder. It features micro-democracy, and micro-democracy is awesome.
Okay, on the subject of examples of political literature, why not just everything written by Ursula Le Guin?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
One another question. Can you? No. That's a short one. That's a short one. I had a short one. Yeah, I have the right.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay. Sometimes you speak about more than one political context. I just remembered about Ursula Le Guin short story that was basically about ecology, but it was, for me, basically how sometimes capitalism replicates as communism and only gets the bad parts. And it really felt like the Israeli side for me, but that's unrelated. So can you talk about more than one context, politically, in a book?
How many political issues you put in a book?
Yeah.
I can name how many political issues I can put in a short story with less than 1,000 words.
Yes, the answer is yes, you can do plural.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time. We're rushing through these last 4.
Okay, I'll try to be quick about it. My voice sounds really different in the microphone. I should have expected that.
Yeah, just talk.
Sorry. During the panel, you talked a lot about female writers, and all the recommendations were of women authors. And you talked in the beginning about how male author or men authors describe women. Is writing sort of political or controversial? Yeah, controversial political stuff. Is it something that is, in a way, a women author's thing? Is it something that you cannot expect a male writer to do, or in a way, something that is so much harder for male authors to do because they are the default human being in most media?
I'm not sure that, I don't think that's the case. I do think that women and folks who are not men, right, do have a non-default view, and folks who are not men may read those better, you know, say, well, we recognize the view in this. But I do think there are a lot of guys doing some really interesting work. It's just maybe they're not necessarily doing the kind of work that is resonating with, for instance, me personally. I'll name, actually somebody who I should have named earlier is Max Gladstone. I don't know if any of y'all have read Max Gladstone's fantasies. He's a guy who...
I may or may not have published Three Parts Dead.
Oh, okay. Well, Three Parts Dead is fabulous, and he's a male author who actually does a really good job writing women.
Men are allowed to write.
Men are allowed to
Some of them actually write really well. Daryl is a man.
Yeah.
Yes, a man was mentioned, that's Daryl. Also, I'll quickly mention Robert Jackson Bennett.
Oh, yeah.
Also mention, Lois McMaster-Bujold is a woman. You wanted more men.
She writes, did he give the audience another question?
Yeah, we'll have as many questions as we can.
And also, very quickly, Yoon Ha Lee, who is a trans man and is a terrific author.
Yoon's stuff is fabulous. Yeah, I love his work.
Okay, so I might be a bit of a naive science fiction reader. I've always, when trying to explain to my friends why science fiction is amazing, said that one of the things is that distancing political topics to something that is far away and detached from you makes it easier for people to see the truth in that. But from hearing your conversation during this hour and a half, it really doesn't sound like people are taking it so lightly. So if that's out the window, putting the topic of wonder aside, why science fiction? What was your experience in writing as like the crowd being able to take in topics you raised?
Because everything is better with spaceships, robots, and dragons.
This is true, but this is just truth. That's just a universal truth. But the other thing is when you say...
is the truth universally known?
It is a truth universally accepted. Yes, that any spaceship and one of a unicorn. No, the sentence isn't coming right. No, I actually, despite the fact that there has been reaction to very overtly political science fiction, it's still easier to talk about some things science fictionally than it is to talk about them in realistic terms. Sometimes it's just easier to show things. It isn't necessarily that we can sneak science fictional vegetables into the chocolate cake of the story, right? It's that you're not getting the vegetables at all, right? There are things you can't see that are around us and so common, and when you put something in a really different context, that shows things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see at all. And so that's part of it. And it also gives you deniability. You know, you're writing in a situation where maybe the government doesn't want you to criticize the government, and you can say, I'm not criticizing the president. This is about spaceships and aliens. What are you talking about? So that's still operational. But no matter what, even when you if you're trying to sort of sneak in the politics, there are going to be people who see it and say, oh no, or who don't even know why they react badly to it. They're just like, this is upsetting to me, and it's because it's challenging them. So just because it's not perfect doesn't mean that that isn't part of its virtue, part of its strength.
Yeah, and I will very briefly mention basically all Soviet-era science fiction,
yes,
which was all what you just said.
Science fiction is, yeah.
Well, we aren't in the 50s anymore, so it's not only Asimov, and you can write about incarceration or maybe even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know, haven't read it yet. But putting puppies aside, do you still think you have political taboos you can't write because of community backlash that you feel you're gonna get?
So, I think anything you write, and especially anything you write that's going to be a strong opinion, right, is going to get some kind of backlash. I think that the folks who say, I'm afraid to write such and such because of the backlash, sometimes that's very sincere, but sometimes the people who say it publicly are being a little disingenuous. You always are going to get backlash for stating your opinions. It doesn't matter, you know, where it is, and it's a question of, do you think you can handle the backlash? And I'm not going to lie, sometimes it's not fun. Some of that backlash can be really awful, but I don't think there are things that can't be written about because of the backlash. I think it's a question of each writer has to decide what they're willing to put up with the backlash for, if that makes sense.
Okay, we are literally out of time.
But I have a good answer.
Is it a one
And
sentence?
it's a short one.
Okay,
Let's hear
go
it.
ahead.
Thank you. Being #1 target for anti-vaccination movement in Israel for the past 5 years, I don't really care about the backlash of my science fiction.
Single sentence.
Hi, my name is Maya, and my question is for Anne Mackey. When you wrote Ancillary Justice, did you want just to have fun with a female pronoun world, or you deliberately want to say women are misrepresented? I wanted to voice it more. I wanted to make it interesting. I want to make people think, because it sure made me think.
It was both. I started out saying, oh, wouldn't it be fun? And then thinking, you know why it would be fun? Because women are I am a native English speaker and a professional writer. I am good at English. I talk good.
That's what happens when you take my words.
That's what I get. That's what I get. No, all of those things, yes. Because then I started out with what I thought was a simple project, and then realized all those other things, and I was like, darn it, I'm gonna, yeah, absolutely.
And with that, I would like to thank Dr. Lensman and Leslie for a fabulous panel. I'd like to thank you for coming and asking your questions. And
ובואו נדורות, 6 בדצמבר בגבעת רם בירושלים, פרנקנשטיין.
tomorrow, I'll be doing a Q&A with Anne. There'll also be a lot of audience questions then. We'll talk about her career and her writing. It'll be super fun. Come on down.